You're wasting $3,000 on a building that's already dead. That is what my mother said the afternoon I handed over every dollar I had saved in 4 years to buy a shuttered diner on the edge of Millhaven, Ohio. She said it at the kitchen table of the house I'd grown up in, with my father nodding beside her and my brother, Ryan, pulling a face like I'd announced I was moving to the moon. I want you to hold that sentence in your mind, because that sentence is where this whole story begins. And what happened 4 years later to the building they called dead, none of them saw it coming. Not even close. Welcome back. You're listening to Calm Drama Stories, where we sit with ordinary people, hard choices, and the quiet moment when everything finally turns. If you've ever made a decision that the people who loved you refused to take seriously, if you've ever been laughed at for believing in something before anyone else did, this one is for you. Pull up a chair, stay with me, because the part where it turns is worth the wait. Hit subscribe before we go any further, and then let's get back to it. My name is Celeste Mercer, and I was 29 the year I bought the diner. I want to tell you who I was before all of it, because the kind of person you are before a thing happens is the whole reason the thing happens the way it does. I grew up in Millhaven, which is the kind of town that shows up on maps as a dot with a number beside it, population 4,200, give or take the years. My father Carl worked at the grain elevator on Route 12 for 31 years. My mother Linda taught third grade and kept a tight house and a tighter budget, and believed that security was the one virtue that mattered. My brother Ryan was 5 years older than me and had always been the one who got the benefit of the doubt. He was the one who needed a loan for the truck and got it. He was the one whose college bills got paid, while mine got split 2 ways with a scholarship I'd worked 3 summers to earn. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because it's the foundation everything else sits on. In my family, Ryan's risks were investments. Mine were mistakes waiting to happen. I had been working as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing firm in Millhaven since I was 23. The kind of job that is steady and unremarkable and pays you enough to live without quite enough to breathe. I kept the firm's accounts, and in my own time I kept a second set of books, a private spreadsheet, which I ran like a second job. I tracked every dollar I earned, every dollar I spent, and a column I labeled the number, which was the amount I was building toward without quite being able to name what I was building toward it for. By the time I was 29, the number was $11,400. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store on Clement Street. No car payment, no cable. One streaming subscription I shared with my neighbor Dolars, who was 72 and only used it to watch baking competitions. I brought lunch to work every day in a blue thermal bag I'd had since college. I was not a person who spent impulsively. I was a person who measured. Here is what I knew about the diner. It had been called Harlan's since 1971, when a man named Harlan Pruitt had opened it in the squat brick building on the corner of Route 12 and Elm. It had served breakfast and lunch to grain elevator workers and school teachers and everyone else in Millhaven for 46 years. Harlan had run it himself until he was 79, when his knees gave out, and his son, who was supposed to take it over, moved to Arizona instead. It closed on a Thursday in November, quietly, a paper sign taped in the window that said, "Thank you, Millhaven." The building sat empty for 2 years after that. Nobody wanted it. Nobody in town thought there was a future in a 600-square-foot lunch counter with a dropped ceiling and a grease trap that needed servicing. Nobody except me. I had eaten at Harlan's every birthday of my childhood. It was the one restaurant in Millhaven that my mother didn't have to budget extra for. A plate of eggs and toast cost $4.25 in 1998. Harlan himself, a large quiet man with forearms like Doc Rope, made your coffee without being asked and remembered your order the second time you came in. He was the kind of person who ran a business the way some people tend a garden, without fuss, without drama, with a steady daily attentiveness that made the thing grow. When the building went on the market, listed by the county at $3,000 for quick clearance of a tax liability, I had been watching it for 6 months. I ran the numbers. I ran them in the spreadsheet, and then I ran them by hand on paper, because I trusted my pencil more than I trusted the screen when something mattered. The building was structurally sound. I'd had a retired contractor, named Bud Sivers, walk through it with me on a Tuesday morning for $75 and his honest opinion. The kitchen equipment was old but repairable. The location was the best corner in Millhaven, 100 feet from the entrance to the grain elevator, directly across from the elementary school. Harlan had run lean for 46 years, which meant the bones of the operation were efficient even when the paint was peeling. I did not tell my family I was thinking about it. Not because I was secretive by nature, but because I knew what they would say and I needed to finish thinking before I was told to stop. On a Friday afternoon in March, I drove to the county office and I signed the papers and I handed over a cashier's check for $3,000. Every dollar of it mine. I kept a worn green receipt book in my coat pocket that day, the kind with the carbon copy pages and the little metal clasp at the top. I had bought it at the hardware store below my apartment for $2.19. I wrote the date and the amount on the first page, and I put it back in my pocket. That receipt book was the first record of what Harlan's would become, and I kept it. I still have it. I want you to know that now because it matters later in a way I couldn't have imagined standing in that county office on a cold Friday in March. I told my family that Sunday at dinner. The table at my parents' house has 8 chairs and seats 4 people comfortably. My mother sets it for every Sunday dinner with the good placemats and the gravy boat even when there's no gravy, because that is the kind of woman she is. Ryan had driven up with his girlfriend Casey, and a 6-pack he'd set in the fridge without asking. My father was in his chair at the head of the table in the way he'd been in that chair every Sunday since before I was born, comfortable as furniture. I waited until the food was passed before I said anything. I told them plainly. I had purchased the old Harlan's building on Route 12. I was planning to reopen it as a diner. I had paid $3,000, my own savings, and I had a plan. The silence lasted 3 seconds. I counted. Then my mother said the sentence she had already assembled before I finished talking. You're wasting $3,000 on a building that's already dead. My father said nothing. He looked at his plate. Ryan laughed. Not a mean laugh, I want to be careful about that. Ryan was not a mean person. He was a person who thought he understood risk because he'd seen my parents manage theirs, carefully and conservatively for 30 years. He laughed the way people laugh at something they find innocently absurd, the way you'd laugh if someone told you they'd decided to sail across a lake in a bathtub. Sel, he said, that place has been sitting empty for 2 years. There's a reason nobody wanted it. I said I knew the reason. Nobody wanted to do the work. My mother set down her fork. Her name, Linda Mercer, is a person who uses precision the way other people use volume. She doesn't raise her voice when she is trying to cut something down. She gets quieter, more specific. She said, I hope you haven't made this final. A tax sale property is hard to walk back from. You could lose that money with nothing to show for it. I told her I wasn't walking back from anything. She looked at my father. He looked at his plate. The dinner continued. Ryan asked about the plumbing. It was the kind of question that sounds like interest but is actually a list of objections delivered as questions. What about the plumbing? What about the health permit? What about the equipment? What about the liability insurance? I answered each one. I had already looked into each one, and with each answer, I could see the questions running out without the concern running out with them. When people don't believe in a thing, the evidence barely touches them. It just bounces off and lands somewhere they don't have to look at it. Casey, to her credit, said the food at Harlan's had always been good. Ryan shot her a look that was not a look I appreciated. I drove home after dinner with the receipt book still in my coat pocket. I sat in my apartment with the spreadsheet open and I ran the numbers again. They still came out the same. They were going to come out the same for as long as I was willing to look at them squarely. I stayed up until midnight writing the first draft of a business plan on a yellow legal pad. 7 pages, front and back, in my own handwriting, because the act of writing it by hand made it real in a way the screen hadn't yet. The next morning I started work on the building. I want to tell you about that first month because it is the part that nobody who wasn't there will believe, and it is also the part that made everything else possible. I had $8,400 left in savings after the purchase. I needed a functional kitchen, a health permit, a liquor-free breakfast and lunch license, which was simpler than the full license, liability insurance, and enough supplies to open. The contractor quotes I'd gotten for a full renovation ran between $40,000 and $65,000. I did not have $40,000. I had $8,400 and a bookkeeper's instinct for what you could cut without cutting bone. The first thing I did was call Bud Sivers, the retired contractor who'd walked the building with me. I told him what I had. He came back the next afternoon with 2 of his sons, grown men with their own trades, and a yellow notepad of his own. He walked me through what was structural, what was cosmetic, and what I could do myself with the right YouTube video and a weekend. He was not sentimental. He was not encouraging in the empty way people are encouraging when they don't believe in something but want to be kind. He was honest, and honest was exactly what I needed. The grease trap needs a professional, he said. The plumbing under the counter is sound, just the fixtures are ugly. The ceiling tiles are a weekend job. The floor is original linoleum and it's fine, scrub it. The hood vents need cleaning, not replacing. The refrigeration units need service, not replacement. And the counter stools, he counted them, 12 of them bolted to the floor, are solid as the day they were poured. He quoted me $3,200 for the work his sons would do. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I spent the next 3 weekends there myself with cleaning supplies, a rented floor polisher, and more knee work than I had ever done in my life. I took down the dropped ceiling tiles that were water-stained and put up new ones from the hardware store in 4-hour sessions after my regular job. I repainted the front room in a cream color I had seen in a photo of a diner in Vermont that I had saved to my phone 6 months earlier. I ray-caulked the window frames. I scrubbed the lunch counter with a determination that was partly practical and partly personal. Dolers, my 72-year-old neighbor who shared the streaming account, found out what I was doing and showed up one Saturday morning with rubber gloves and strong opinions about grout. I didn't ask her to come. She just appeared. She cleaned the back bathroom with a focus that frankly alarmed me. When she left at noon, she patted my arm and said, "Good bones in that place. Always had good bones." Then she drove home in her little green car, and I stood in the middle of Harlan's and looked at what 3 weeks of evenings and weekends had done to it. It was beginning to look like somewhere a person might want to eat. I should tell you about the other person who showed up. His name was Walt Prout. He was Harlan's son, the one who had moved to Arizona, who had come back to Millhaven after a divorce and a health scare to take care of a few things, and was passing the old building one afternoon when he saw my car parked out front and the lights on inside. He knocked. I almost didn't answer. I was in the back wrestling with a supply shelf that had come off its brackets. But the knock came again, and something about it made me put down the shelf bracket and go to the door. He was 60, broad through the shoulders like his father had been, with a gray beard and work boots and the look of a man who was somewhere between being done with things and not quite sure what he was doing next. He looked at the cleaned windows and the new ceiling tiles and the polished floor, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "My dad would have been glad someone finally did something with it." I told him I was trying. He came in. We stood at the counter where his father had stood for 46 years, and he told me about the equipment. Which burner had the hot spot? Which refrigerator door had to be lifted slightly when you closed it or it wouldn't seal right? Which of the prep shelves was original, and which had been replaced in 1994 when a health inspector had been less than impressed? He talked for an hour, and I wrote down everything he said in the green receipt book because it was the paper I had in my pocket. Before he left, he went behind the counter to the cabinet where the old order pads had been kept, and he pulled one out. A yellow pad with carbon copy, exactly like the receipt book, just older. He looked at it for a second and then he set it on the counter. Not giving it to me, just setting it there for anyone to take. He wrote every order for 46 years, Walt said. Never missed a customer. I left the pad where he'd set it. It felt like it belonged on the counter, not in my pocket. Walt Prout came back the next Saturday with a toolbox and no fanfare. He fixed the refrigerator door and the hot spot burner and 3 things I hadn't gotten to yet. He didn't ask for payment. I tried twice. He waved it off the way his father had waved off coffee refills, a small gesture that meant the matter was settled. He was there the morning I opened. He sat at the counter and ordered eggs and toast and black coffee, and when I set the plate in front of him, he looked at it the way someone looks at a thing they weren't sure they'd ever see again. "Same eggs," he said. I didn't know that was the first time he'd eaten in this room in 6 years. He didn't tell me until much later. That is the kind of man Walt Prout turned out to be, generous with his presence and quiet about his reasons. I opened Harlan's on a Wednesday morning in late April, 6 weeks after the purchase. I opened at 6 a.m. and by 6:45 I had 7 customers, all of them grain elevator workers who had eaten at Harlan's before it closed and had watched the building sit empty and had apparently been waiting for someone to turn the lights back on. One of them, a man named Gerald Finch who had worked at the elevator for 22 years, sat down at the counter and ordered a number 2 without looking at the menu. I had to tell him gently that I hadn't written a number 2 on the menu yet. He looked at me. "Eggs, sausage, home fries, wheat toast, extra butter on the side," he said. "That was the number 2. I wrote it down in the receipt book. the fourth entry below the purchase price, the permit fee, and the first week's supply order. The first month I brought in $847. After supplies and the insurance payment and the first installment to Bud's sons, I netted $211. I was not discouraged. A first month is not a business. A first month is a test of whether there is a heartbeat, and there was a heartbeat. My family did not come to the opening. I had not told them the date. That was not an accident. My mother called the following week. She had heard from someone at the school that the diner had opened. Millhaven is 4,200 people, there are no secrets. She asked how it was going. I said it was going. She asked if I was covering my costs. I said I was working on it. She said, in the careful tone she used for things she'd already decided, that she hoped I had a backup plan. I told her I was the backup plan. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Celeste, I just don't want you to be embarrassed." I thanked her and ended the call. I want to stop here a second. I know some of you are in the middle of something right now that the people who were supposed to believe in you don't believe in. If you've ever had someone you love tell you your dream was an embarrassment before you'd even had a chance to fail, leave one word below for me. Just one. I read every one and I'll know exactly what it means. And if you want to see where this goes, hit subscribe. I'm going to bring you all the way to the end of it. Now back to it. The second month was $1,340. The third was $1,890. I want to tell you what was happening in those months because it was not what I expected and it was not what my spreadsheet had modeled for. What was happening was community. I had not planned for community. I had planned for a lunch counter operation serving a captive audience of elevator workers and school staff. What I had not planned for was the older men who had nowhere to go on a Tuesday morning after they retired, who started appearing at 7 a.m. and staying until 9. What I had not planned for was the teachers from the elementary school who crossed the street for lunch 3 days a week and started telling each other about the soup, which changed every day and which I made from scratch every morning because Harlan had made soup every morning, and I had found his laminated recipe cards in the cabinet behind the counter, 47 of them in a rubber-banded stack, and I used them like scripture. Walt recognized the soups. He came in one Thursday when I had beef barley on the board, the same beef barley from card number 11 in the stack, and he sat at the counter for a long time after he was done eating, not saying anything, just sitting. "He made that one every November," Walt said finally. "November's my best month for it too," I said. He nodded. He left the exact amount plus $2 on the counter, like he always did. I was not sleeping much. I was at the diner by 5:30 every morning, and at my bookkeeping job by 1 in the afternoon and back to the diner accounts by 7 in the evening. I had hired one part-time person, a 17-year-old named Petra who lived 2 streets over and was saving for a car, and worked the lunch rush with the focus of someone who has a target. She was fast, and she didn't break things, and she asked good questions about why I did the prep the way I did. Those were the 3 criteria I had. Dolars came in for breakfast every Thursday and always sat at the second stool from the left, which she had decided was the best stool without offering her methodology. She ordered the same thing, 1 egg poached, wheat toast, black coffee, no shortcuts. She told me every week whether the toast was right. It was not always right. Her standards for toast were exacting. In the evenings after close, I sat at the counter with the receipt book and my yellow legal pad and I tracked everything. Not just the money, though the money was what I had started with. I tracked the regulars, who came what days, which items they reliably ordered, what time the rush peaked, what I overordered and underordered each week. I filled those yellow pages with the data of a small operation trying to understand itself. The receipts stacked up in the green book, each one a page with its carbon, every transaction in its own handwriting. By month 6, I was netting $1,100 after all costs. By month 8, I hired Petra full-time and she quit needing the car money, or rather she got the car and kept working anyway, which told me something important about how she felt about the place. My brother Ryan came in for the first time in month 7. He came with Casey, who had never stopped wanting to try it, and he ordered the number 2, which I had by then put on the menu exactly as Gerald Finch had described it. He looked around at the lunch counter and the cream walls and the original linoleum, polished now to a dull warm shine, and the 12 stools bolted to the floor, and at the laminated recipe cards I had framed and hung in a row above the window, and he was quiet in a way he was not usually quiet. "It looks good in here, Sel," he said. I said thank you and brought him his eggs. He paid and left a good tip and I tucked it into the till and did not make a thing of it. Because there are two kinds of people in any new story. There are the ones who show up when it's easy and the ones who show up when it isn't. Ryan was the first kind. I don't hate him for it, but I know which kind he is. My mother did not come, not in month 7, not in month 8. The phone calls continued, slightly warmer in tone. She began asking questions that were no longer entirely rhetorical. What was my revenue looking like? Whether I was thinking about expanding the hours. Whether I'd looked into small business grants. I answered each question plainly. I did not tell her the full numbers, not yet. The numbers were mine and the time for sharing them was not her timelines to set. What I noticed, over those months, was how completely the silence had become ordinary. In the beginning, every time my phone showed her name, something in me went alert with the particular hope that there might be a different conversation on the other end of it. A sentence that started with, "I've been thinking," or "I drove by," and or even just, "How is it really going?" I kept the hope small so it wouldn't be expensive when it came to nothing, but I kept it. By month 8, the hope had settled into something quieter and more manageable. Not gone, but no longer in the foreground. I was too busy. The lunch rush didn't slow down for anyone's family dynamics. There were prep lists and supplier emails and a health permit renewal, and a second hire to think about. I did not tell anyone I was waiting. I did not let myself speak it. But in the evenings, after close, when I sat at the counter with the receipt book and the legal pad, there was sometimes a moment between the last entry and the next one where I sat in the quiet of the building and thought about what it would have been like to have someone at the opening. Someone who believed it was worth opening for. Walt had been there, Dollars had been there. Gerald Finch had been there at 6:45 on day 1 without me asking. Those were not nothing. Those were, it turned out, everything. But there is a particular kind of ache that is not about what you have. It is about who didn't show up. And I will not pretend it wasn't there, because it was there, and being honest about it matters more to me than sounding invulnerable. The end of the first year looked like this in the receipt book: $14,300 in total revenue, $6,800 net after all costs, 11 months of operation after a month of renovation. I wrote that number in the book on New Year's Eve, sitting at the counter alone after close with a cup of coffee I'd made for myself, the first coffee I'd had all day that wasn't poured for someone else. I looked at the number for a while. It was not the number I had projected in the original plan. It was about 12% better. I let myself feel that for exactly 1 cup of coffee. Then I started the next year's spreadsheet. There were things I had gotten wrong in year 1 that I wanted to fix. The supply ordering was still not tight enough. I was occasionally running out of the potato leek soup midday, which cost me sales, and left the regulars disappointed in a way that disproportionately damaged goodwill. The prep schedule needed adjustment. I had been doing certain cuts myself that Petra could handle if I showed her properly, which meant I was using skilled labor time on tasks that didn't require it. I rewrote the prep schedule over 2 evenings in January. I renegotiated the produce contract with my supplier, a man named Roger who drove a refrigerated truck out of Ashland, and who responded well to the fact that I paid on time every single invoice. He gave me a 6% reduction on my standing order. In the bookkeeping world, a 6% reduction on your primary cost input is not small. I put it back into quality. In year 2, I hired a second person, a retired cook named Dale who had worked at a diner in Canton for 20 years and had moved back to Millhaven to be near his grandchildren, and was going quietly out of his mind with nothing to do. He came in one morning as a customer, ate a plate of eggs, and then leaned over the counter and told me my hash browns were finely cut when they should be coarsely cut. I asked him how he knew. He told me. I hired him the next day. Dale and I did not always agree. That is the kindest way to say it. Dale had opinions about every decision I made, and he delivered them in the direct manner of a man who had nothing left to lose by honesty. He was right about 70% of the time, which is a batting average I would take in any kitchen. With Dale, I pushed to a 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. day, adding a full lunch service I'd been handling alone up to that point. The new hours brought in the afternoon crowd I'd been missing: delivery drivers, the hardware store staff, people running errands who wanted to sit somewhere for 20 minutes before continuing. Revenue in year 2 averaged $6,400 a month. Net after costs, $2,700. I moved out of the apartment above the hardware store and into a small house 2 blocks away from the diner because the commute was 11 minutes and I was spending 11 minutes of sleep every morning for no reason. Walt Prout had a key to the diner. I had given it to him in month 3, and he had not asked for it and had not expected it. He used it occasionally to leave things: a bag of potatoes from his garden, a box of his father's old coffee mugs he'd found in storage, once a handwritten note that said only, "Your soup is right." He came in for breakfast 3 or 4 times a week, and sat at the counter, and ate without rushing and left without making himself the center of anything. He was the kind of presence that makes a place feel established. The customers who had known Harlan noticed Walt and gave him a particular nod, the kind that means, "Good, things are continuing. I will tell you about the thing that almost ended it in year 2, because I promised you an honest account, and I want to be honest about the parts where I was frightened." In April of the second year, the county health inspector came for a routine inspection and found a problem with the ventilation in the kitchen, a damper in the hood vent that had shifted during the winter and was no longer clearing exhaust correctly. This was a legitimate concern. Ventilation in a working kitchen is not a matter you negotiate. The inspector gave me a conditional notice: fix the ventilation within 30 days or close until the repair was complete. The repair estimate was $4,800. I had $3,100 in the business account. The shortfall was $1,700, and I had 30 days and no room to borrow from my personal savings, which I had already committed to the house. I will not pretend I was calm about this. I sat at the counter after close that evening with the conditional notice in my hand, and I went through every option I could think of methodically, the way you go through things when you're a bookkeeper, and you've trained yourself to trust the numbers even when you don't like them. None of the options were clean. The best one involved a short-term loan at a rate I didn't love and a payment schedule I'd have to restructure everything around. Walt came in the next morning before I opened. He had a key and he used it, and when I looked up from the prep counter I must have been visibly not fine because he sat down and said simply, "What happened?" I told him. I showed him the notice. He read it once and set it on the counter. "How much short are you?" he said. I told him. He picked up the notice again. He looked at it for a long time, then he put it in his shirt pocket and said he'd be back in an hour. He came back in 47 minutes. He had a check in his hand, written on his own personal account for $1,700. He set it on the counter face down and said, "That's a loan. You can pay me back whenever it stops being tight. No interest, no schedule, just pay it back when you can." I told him I couldn't take money from him. He said, "My father built this counter. I'm not watching it close over a damper." I took the check. I cashed it. I paid Bud Siver's youngest son to fix the ventilation in 11 days. The follow-up inspection passed without issue. I paid Walt back in 4 installments over the next 6 months. He wrote each repayment receipt in his own handwriting and filed them without comment. That is the kind of man he is. I want you to know that. Not because it changes the business story, but because some people deserve to be known for what they actually did. In year 3, something happened that I had not been planning for, though in retrospect my spreadsheet had been pointing at it for 2 years. A small regional food publication ran a short piece about working diners still operating in small Ohio towns. They listed Harlan's in a sidebar, 3 sentences: reopened 2019, new owner, original recipes, worth the detour. I had not submitted anything to them. A reader had written in to recommend it. Those 3 sentences sent 40 people to Millhaven in 1 week, people who drove an hour to eat at a diner they'd read about in a sidebar. I know the number because I checked. I tracked where new customers said they'd heard about us. Of the 40, 17 came back at least once. Of the 17, 9 became regulars. 9 regulars from 3 sentences in a regional publication. That is the arithmetic of word of mouth when the product is right. I submitted nothing else to publications after that. I didn't need to, the word was moving on its own. By the end of year 3, monthly revenue averaged $11,200. Net, $5,100. I had paid off the remainder of the original renovation costs. I had fully repaid Walt. I had hired a 3rd person and was considering a 4th. The green receipt book was nearly full. I bought a 2nd one, same kind, same hardware store, $2.19. My father called me one Sunday evening in the 3rd year. Carl Mercer was not a man who made phone calls. He communicated in person and in silence, and the silence had always been his loudest register. He called me from the house phone, which my mother never used because she had her cell, and there was something in that detail, the house phone, my father, Sunday evening, that made me put down what I was doing. He said, "I drove by today, the parking lot was full." That was all. He didn't say he was proud, he was not a man with that word easy in his mouth. He said the parking lot was full, and in the language my father spoke, that was the same thing. I said, "It usually is." He said, "Good," and he hung up. I held the phone for a minute in my kitchen. It was not the apology, it was not a reckoning. It was a 68-year-old man from Millhaven, Ohio, who had spent 31 years at the grain elevator and 3 years watching his daughter do something he hadn't understood, and the parking lot finally gave him a language for what he was seeing. I accepted it for what it was. In the spring of year 4, a developer reached out. His name was Marcus Feld, and he represented a company that was buying commercial properties along Route 12 as part of a planned mixed-use development, retail and residential, 3 blocks from the diner. He sat across from me at the counter on a Thursday afternoon when the lunch rush had cleared, and he slid a card across to me and said he'd like to talk about the building. I told him I'd be glad to listen. He said the company was interested in acquiring the property. The development along Route 12 had appreciated the corridor significantly. A professional appraisal, he said, of the Harlan's building, with its current operating business attached, would come in, he estimated, somewhere in the range of $290,000 to $320,000. I looked at him across the counter that Harlan Prute had built in 1971. He slid a single-page offer summary across to me. The number at the bottom was $270,000. I did not reach for the paper. I said I wasn't interested in selling. He said he understood that this was just an opening conversation and left his card. I put the card in the receipt book between 2 of the carbon pages, not because I was tempted, because I am a bookkeeper and I keep records. $312,000. That was the number the certified appraiser put on the property 2 weeks later when I hired one myself, because I am a person who needs to see the actual number rather than a developer's estimate. $312,000 for a building I had purchased for $3,004 years and 3 months earlier. I want to be very careful here about what I'm telling you. I did not buy the diner to prove my family wrong. I bought it because the numbers made sense to me, and because I understood something about Millhaven that the tax assessor's office apparently did not, which is that a town of 4,200 people with 1 grain elevator and 1 elementary school has a lunch counter-shaped hole in the middle of it, and someone patient enough to fill it correctly will do well. I was right. I am glad I was right. And I am glad I had the appraisal in my hand when what happened next happened. Here is what happened next. Ryan called me on a Thursday evening, which was unusual enough that I answered before I'd checked the caller ID. He and Casey had gotten engaged over the winter and they were looking at buying a house, and the market was harder than they'd expected, and the conversation started there, in that practical key, before it slid towards something else. He said carefully, the way Ryan approaches things he's thought about first, that Mom and Dad had been talking, that they'd heard the diner was doing well, that they were really proud of everything I'd built. I said that was good to hear. He said that they had also been thinking, and here the careful tone got more careful, about whether there might be room for family involvement now that the business was established. He framed it as an opportunity for the family to be involved, to be part of what I'd done. I was quiet for a moment. I let the sentence settle. What involvement did you have in mind? I said. And Ryan, to his credit, said it plainly. They were wondering if there might be a stake available, an ownership piece, something that would let the family share in the business going forward. 4 years earlier, I had stood at my parents' kitchen table with a cashier's check for $3,000 and told them what I was doing, and my mother had said I was wasting my money on a building that was already dead. I did not say that. I let it stay where it was in the past, where it belonged. I said, Rye, when I bought the building, I asked for nothing from anyone. I figured it out alone. The business is mine. He said he understood that. I said, when it was hard, no one was in it with me. He said he knew that too, and he was quiet for a second, and I heard something in his quiet that was more honest than the ask had been, something that might have been shame. So the answer is no, I said. Not out of spite, just out of arithmetic. The risk was mine, so is the outcome. He didn't argue. He said he'd figured I might say that. He said he hoped we were still okay. I told him we were okay. We are okay. Ryan and I, we are 2 siblings who understand each other clearly now, which is its own kind of peace. I hung up and I sat at the counter for a while in the quiet of the closed diner with the lights on low and the green receipt book open in front of me. I ran my hand along the counter, the worn edge where Harlan's elbows had rested for 46 years and where mine rested now. I thought about the February morning I had walked into this room with rubber gloves and a floor polisher and the particular stubbornness of someone who has seen a number she trusts. The following Saturday, my mother came in. I want to tell you about this the way it actually was, without the version where I'm large about it, and without the version where I'm small about it. She came in at 9 a.m. on a Saturday when the counter was full, and the soup was on, and Petra was managing 3 plates at once with the efficiency she'd built over 2 years. My mother sat down at the only open stool, which happened to be the one Dollars didn't claim until 10 on Saturdays, the second stool from the left. She sat with her purse on her lap the way she sat in places she wasn't sure of. I brought her a menu. I brought her water. I did not make a scene of it and I did not make it a moment. She looked around at the lunch counter and the cream walls and the 12 stools and the framed recipe cards above the window, Harlan's handwriting in laminated rows. She looked at the board where I had the soup of the day, which was potato leek from card number 23 in the stack. "It's nice," she said, quietly, as a statement, not a compliment. "The distinction matters with my mother." I said, "Thank you." She ordered eggs and toast and coffee. I brought them. She ate without rushing, which was unusual for her. She was a woman who moved through meals efficiently. She watched the counter for a while. She watched Petra. She watched Dale in the kitchen. She watched Walt Prout, who had come in for his usual and was sitting 3 stools down reading a newspaper. When she was done, she reached into her purse and she put some bills on the counter. Exactly the right amount and a tip. She stood up and smoothed her coat. She said, "I should have come sooner." Not "I'm sorry," not "I was wrong." My mother does not have those words in a form she can say out loud. But "I should have come sooner" from Linda Mercer is the same thing with different walls around it, and I knew that and I accepted it. "You came now," I said. She nodded. She left. I stood at the counter and I watched her walk to her car in the parking lot and I let myself feel the full weight of what it was and what it wasn't, all at once. It was not the apology I had perhaps once wanted. It was not enough to unsay the things that had been said at that Sunday dinner table 4 years earlier. But it was a woman of 64 who had driven herself to a place she should have come to long before, and sat down, and ate her eggs, and said out loud that she should have come sooner. That was real. I kept it for what it was. I went to tell Walt because Walt was 3 stools down and had watched the whole thing and deserved to know what he had seen. "That was my mother," I said. He turned a page of the newspaper. "I figured," he said. "You've got the same eyes." I went back to work. Here is what the diner became, not the numbers, you have those, what it became in the actual daily life of it. It became the place where Gerald Finch ate breakfast every morning and argued with Dale about whether the home fries should have onions, which they should not according to Dale, which they absolutely should according to Gerald, and which I resolved by putting onions on the side so Gerald could add them himself, and Dale could claim a moral victory. It became the place where Petra saved enough for a car, and then enough for a second year of community college, and then enough for a 4-year program, and who told me on a Tuesday morning in year 4 that the diner was the reason she'd figured out she wanted to study business. It became the place where Walt Prout sat 3 or 4 mornings a week at the counter his father had built, and ate the soup his father had written the recipe for, and was, in some way I have no tidy word for, still in the room with his father. It became the place where Dollars sat every Thursday at the second stool from the left, and told me whether the toast was right. In year 3 she had a health scare, nothing catastrophic but enough to be frightening, and when she came back to the counter 6 weeks later, thinner and moving more carefully, she sat down and I put her toast in front of her without being asked and she said, "Now that's right," and that was the whole conversation but we both knew what it meant. I kept the green receipt book. Both of them now. The first one and the second. They sit in the cabinet behind the counter where Harlan kept his order pads. The first entry is still the date in March and the amount, $3,000, written in my handwriting on a cold afternoon in the county office. Below it, every record of what came after. The $211 first month net. The $1,700 Walt loaned me. The repair costs and the insurance and the first delivery from the produce supplier and Gerald Finch's standing order for home fries with onions on the side. All of it there. All of it earned. I held the appraisal document the evening after I got it back from the certified appraiser, and I read the number at the bottom again. $312,000. I put it in the cabinet alongside the receipt books. I did not send it to my mother. I did not call Ryan. The number was not for them. It was not a reply to anything they had said. It was simply what it was. a record of what happens when the numbers are right and the person doing the math refuses to stop. I closed the diner that evening and I walked home in the spring dark, and the 2 blocks went by fast the way they always do when your mind is somewhere larger than the street. There is a thing about building something by yourself, without a safety net, without anyone's belief propping you up. It is harder. Of course, it is harder. But what you build in that condition, the trust you develop in your own judgment, the knowledge that you can sustain a thing through the frightening months, the quiet certainty that grows from having run the numbers in the dark and then watched them come true, none of that can be given to you. It can only be built. And it can only be built alone. I am not alone now. That is the other thing I want to tell you. Walt Prout still comes in 4 mornings a week. Doller still holds the toast to a standard I now genuinely take pride in meeting. Petra is finishing her 2nd year of business school and works the counter summers and sends me articles about small business strategy that are sometimes wrong and always interesting. Dale is still right 70% of the time and still tells me about it. Gerald Finch has been retired for 2 years and comes in every morning like it's his job. And sometimes in the early morning before anyone arrives, when the kitchen is heating and the soup is starting on the stove from card number whatever it is that day, I stand at the counter in the quiet, and I think about the woman in the county office handing over the cashier's check. The sweat on her palms, the green receipt book in her pocket with the first entry not yet written. She had $3,000 and a spreadsheet and a contractor's honest opinion and the stubbornness of someone who has been underestimated just often enough to stop needing anyone else's agreement. She did not need them to believe it. She just needed to believe it herself. Family, I have come to understand, is not a thing you're assigned at birth and bound to for life regardless of what it does or doesn't do. Family is whoever you find at your table in the years when the table is hard to set. The people at my table were a retired contractor's son with a toolbox and no fanfare, a 72-year-old woman with opinions about toast, a 17-year-old who turned into a businesswoman one lunch rush at a time, a quiet man who sat at his father's counter and called it coming back home, the people who laughed at the $3,000, they can see the parking lot from Route 12. The parking lot is full most days. That is what I have to say to them, and it is the only thing I have to say to them, and I say it without raising my voice. That is my story. One closed diner that wasn't dead, just waiting. One woman who kept the books honest and stayed through the frightening months. And a counter full of people who showed up before it was easy and never stopped showing up after. If someone believed in your quiet thing before anyone else did, go tell them today. You don't want to learn too late who was really in your corner. If this story found you somewhere it needed to, share it with someone and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.